Max Payne is definitely one interesting series. It's not as well known as GTA or Red Dead Redemption, but it's more acknowledged than games like Bully or Manhunt. It sits in this certain middle spot between the two, where the games within this franchise aren't exactly considered huge hits. However, they do quite well compared to other games not within Rockstar's other franchises. Well, to say the game was made by Rockstar is a bit complicated. Even my head spun when reading into who really made and published this game. For the most part, it's extremely correct to say that Remedy, the developers now known for games such as Control or Contemplate, are the sole creators of this franchise and proprietors of the first game, where Rockstar's only involvement sat at being the ones who would port the game to other platforms other than the PC platform. Today we'll be having a deep dive into the first entry of the Max Payne series, its impact on the gaming space, and how it is 20 years after its initial release. Foremost, to really grasp the game's major components, we've got to take a peek into the peculiar development of this game and how it all came together in the first place. The premise for the game was first posed by Remedy Entertainment in early 1997, after they had completed their first ever game, Death Rally, which was an extremely simplistic racing game with combat mechanics that wasn't exactly a big hit. Interestingly enough, the game's story and scriptwriter had commented in various interviews that the entire starting point of the game, in which they'd build off to create the various components of the game, ranging from the music to the gameplay, is the game's hard-boiled cop, who we all know as Max Payne. The story was pitched to be more deep and psychologically involved than many other games at the time, and to be fair, that was an interesting proposition at a time where games were still figuring out mechanics and other aspects of the game, not worrying about the narrative as much as developers may do now. Whether this concept would carry on to the final product is of much discussion, of which will be discussed further in the video. After Remedy had come up with a game prototype and design document of the project, they'd show this to the company known as 3D Realms, who are primarily the creators of the Duke Nukem franchise. Of course, they would sign a development deal with Remedy, and so would production of the game begin. This is a really enticing note in which I don't think many AAA developers, or many developers as a whole, really do anymore, which is doing a lot more background research in order to build a realistic image of the places they want to create in the game. In this, I mean seeking out inspiration and undertaking the means in order to gain the prowess that inspiration may wield. This could be a place, an artwork, or even people, and designers from Remedy actually took this effort in order to truly form the greatest image of New York that they could. In 1999, these designers traveled from Finland to New York to conduct research on the city's atmosphere, ecosystem, life, and the people within, as they were accompanied with 2 ex-New York Police Department bodyguards to really get some ideas for the environment. And even more incredibly, they took thousands of photographs, in which for the game itself, they would map key locations from those locations in the photographs to utilize within the game's own world. The first trailer of the game's story and a look at its incredibly innovative gameplay at the time was shown at E3 in 1998, attracting much interest due to its unique content and the effects of the game, which at the time were amazingly advanced in terms of its particle-based systems. The game was initially slated to release in the summer of 1999, however it was delayed multiple times and then heavily revamped in the year 2000. Then finally in 2001, the game was released to unanimous critical acclaim and would go on to win many awards. This is the aspect of the game that really pushed me into making this video in the first place, and that's the game's really interesting and engaging mechanics and gameplay structure. The entirety of the game revolves around the use of the famous bullet time mechanics during the shooting sections of the game, in which is about 95% of the game's gameplay component. The bullet time mechanic is so incredibly unique, and you can see the inspiration of its impact leaking into other Rockstar titles such as the Red Dead Redemption series and the Deadeye ability, but of course not to the same extent. The bullet time ability isn't one that needs to be broken down, because at its core, it's an extremely simplistic concept. You need to shoot multiple enemies efficiently without getting gunned down yourself. Well, you trigger the ability then, where time is slowed down to the point where, as it is in the name, bullets and projectiles that are coming your way are slow enough for you to see it with your own eye, and with your own judgment, dodge them and fire shots at enemies before they are even able to respond. It's such an intriguing concept, allowing your reaction to be real time while everything in the game, including Max's own movement, is slowed to a snail's pace. The shooting itself is pretty fun. I don't think, especially by today's standards, it's anything remarkable, but it sure was fun even now. Being able to jump and dive into rooms while wielding a pistol, a shotgun, a sniper, a rifle, or anything of the sort, and being able to plan out your attacks while all the enemies are right in front of you and clearly disadvantaged, you're able to pull off some crazy stunts. Headshotting multiple enemies within a second, or running and utilizing the bullet time ability at the same time, is at the core of the encounters with enemies within Max Payne. The progression through the linear levels usually involves opening doors and running down hallways and passages and gunning down any enemies that are prepared to stop you. One problem that is quite prevalent in the game is the extremely scripted nature of the AI. They clearly cannot think for themselves, as they'll either just take cover, retreat, or approach you, or just throw grenades. This behavior is always scripted, meaning that even though the bulk of the game is just you murdering these enemies in encounters that utilize the same gameplay loop over and over until the game's end, means that after a few hours the diversity of combat may not be as prevalent as it was initially. But what is able to fix this supposed gap in the diversity of combat and gameplay is the bullet time ability itself. With this, it opens a limitless amount of opportunities and ideas that the player can carry out, which for me has always spiced up the gameplay. For many other games, an AI system that is easily predictable and not well done, frankly, by today's standards, is not a game that's going to be easily playable. That's where Remedy found an antidote to the problem, utilizing the bullet time where everything else in the gameplay component is centered around it, which creates for some awesome gameplay. Other than the linear progression of the levels within the game, which is gunning down waves of enemies, there are a few platforming sections and puzzle solving, which isn't anything special, to be honest. Something pretty interesting is when the player doesn't exactly know what to do due to the large but linear levels, Max will say something that hints to what exactly you should be doing. I thought it was a neat addition, and was something that I think all players kind of needed, because the navigation isn't exactly as clear as a map marker appearing in front of you. Not that that's any good. Lastly, I'd like to speak a bit about the interactivity of the game's environments. It could simply be due to me not playing as many games as others, but being able to interact with even the smallest things, such as opening any cabinet I saw, opening any door I saw, or turning on a tap for no reason at all, was really something special. It made the environments a lot more realistic than other games I've played, even in the modern era of video games. There's a certain flair with being able to interact with almost everything, even if it holds no true value to progression or even gameplay, but it's a small feature like this that compounds onto an already interesting set of gameplay mechanics and systems. Well, of course, we've got to discuss the narrative as well. This aspect of the game was the point of contention for critics of the game. It wasn't exactly innovative or psychologically involved as Remedy may have hoped. I think we'll start with a bit of a synopsis to get everyone back to speed, as then we'll discuss some of my thoughts on it as a whole. Max Payne is a former NYPD officer turned detective whose wife Michelle and his newborn daughter Rose are murdered by arms junkies who are high on a new designer drug known as Valkyrie. 3 years after the tragedy, Max has been working undercover within the Punchinello Mafia family, who control the distribution and trafficking of the drug itself. Max is later framed by the family of killing his own detective partner, which makes him hunted by the entire police force, as well as the Mafia family that discovers that he was undercover within their family. Along the way, he breaks down the drug deal's many components and finds that a Russian mobster known as Vladimir Lem started a mob war with the Mafia family. He meets Mona Sachs, who is a hired assassin who seeks retribution in the death of one of the family's highest members for the abuse of her sister. Max, who gets in her way, is spiked with the Valkyrie drug and subsequently tortured by mobsters, but eventually escapes. When he escapes, he raids the family's manor and confronts the boss, who he realizes is just a puppet in a much larger conspiracy. The story ends by Max finding a woman who is responsible for funding the Mafia family as well as manufacturing the drug itself. The game's narrative ends with Max being arrested on top of a skyscraper as he smiles looking down into New York City. The story itself should be prefaced by the fact that it isn't as well developed or utilized as much as it could be. It revolves around the fact that Max, who had scored the American dream, loses all of it in a gritty scheme, which essentially turns him into a rogue detective who is out for blood, killing anything and everything in his path. There's also sequences of the game where he's either drugged or simply hallucinating, getting harrowing glimpses glimpses of a reality that's never actually existed, one so horrific such as him being the one who murdered his own family. These sequences are surely creepy, but they're a nice break from the normal shoot and run that the game's gameplay loop is accustomed to. The story is delivered in real-time cutscenes with voice acting and dialogue, much like any other game out there, but it's got a unique aspect to the way it carries out its narrative that definitely adds some flair to the game. The game has graphic novel-like cutscenes where in these pretty well-drawn panels is dialogue bubbles with voice acting as well, which is responsible for about 90% of what the story is trying to deliver to the player. From what I've seen in terms of a critical look of these panels and this way of delivering the narrative is that it fell short and didn't really add anything to the game. I thought that it was quite an interesting concept, and the comic book style of delivering a story is definitely a unique concept, at least by the standards of the time, and I believe it really complemented the emotion and the way the story was formed. But I've got to say, if we're looking at the game for its narrative, it's really got nothing that stands out as extraordinary in any particular resonance, and a lot of critics actually mentioned that the tropes of the story may be ones that could be developed quite well, but the script writing fails to deliver the impact that the developers probably intended, either due to a limitation of technology or just simple errors within the narrative that made it fall short in many ways, such as its mostly predictable and cliche nature. That pretty much wraps up the first part of the Max Payne retrospective. I've actually played all 3 games in the last month or so I'll be covering the other 2 games in the next week as well. If you'd like to be informed of those videos and their release times, definitely subscribe and keep an eye on the channel for any updates. The first game really encompasses its entire purpose around the concept of time. Moreover, the ability of bullet time, which is the main differentiating factor of the game as opposed to many other shooters or action games out there. Utilizing the relativity of time, the game is able to push a set of gameplay systems and mechanics that are incredibly innovative, engaging, and overly interesting. Although the game may fall flat in some departments such as its story, which really isn't the purpose of the game, as that can easily be attributed to the gameplay, it still is a nice backdrop for the game's various environments, all handcrafted with perfection as mentioned earlier, as real-world research was conducted in order to conceptualize the game's environments. This makes the environments a lot more endearing in the long run, and I think that's why they've aged quite well even 20 years later. Anyway everyone, that's it from me for today's video. I'll see you all in the next one. Have a great day. To call any piece of media a perfect sequel is quite hard. Not much media out there tends to understand in full proportions what made the original great in the first place, and how to correctly expand upon the concepts related in the first part without entirely copying the tropes of that part. It's a common problem seen in movies, games, and books, where the original movie may be an absolute masterpiece deserving of praise from all. The sequel may entirely destroy the reputation, in part due to a lack of originality or an entire lack of understanding as to what made the original great in the first place. So it's quite the triumph when a sequel is able to expand upon the original, stay true to the roots of greatness that grew from the original, and somehow be better than the original in almost all of its aspects. Today we'll be talking about how Max Payne 2 achieves exactly this, a rare example of a perfect video game sequel. Before discussing the usual points such as the development of this game or the gameplay and narrative, we've got to understand what makes a sequel good in the first place. For video games, this question is a lot more jarring than it is for other media. For a movie, it all really depends on how a movie expands upon the original's narrative and world and accentuates it further. For a video game, a sequel must improve the gameplay, the narrative, the controls, and every other aspect which is entirely unique to the medium of video games in order to truly achieve a perfect sequel. In the gameplay department, a sequel has to use the previous game's mechanics and systems as a base or platform to further improve the existing mechanics in place and add entirely new ones to spice up the gameplay. If a sequel sticks to the original in every way, including its own gameplay, the non-experimental nature of the sequel will fall flat for not utilizing the means of new technology and ideas, which will generally result in a failed product. To improve upon an already existing gameplay framework, even one that is fantastic, is to be able to give more of the same, adding new mechanics in order to spice it up and then improving what already exists. Many video game sequels fail to do this. Red Dead Redemption 2 is an absolutely excellent game, but there's not many facets as for one to tell me it truly changed or innovated upon the original in terms of gameplay. It stuck bare bone to the original's mechanics and it struggled in the department of gameplay for this exact reason. A perfect example of a sequel that is able to expand on an already very excellent gameplay system is that of Batman Arkham City. The game utilizes the sticks of Asylum, but it adds more and more sticks to the pile until it starts blazing. Almost everything from the original was perfected and improved upon. This included combos, flying, gadgets, and every other aspect you can think of. In terms of how to expand upon the narrative, that in itself is self-explanatory. Introducing new characters without dismembering the existence of old ones is a feature of a great sequel, but then there's also the case of developing existing characters to further characterize and develop them. Adding new themes not seen in the original while sticking to the roots of what made the original great in the first place is at the heart of a good sequel in terms of a narrative. Expanding the world, the places, and the characters is what makes a sequel actually good. Unlike the original Max Payne, the development of Max Payne 2 is a little bit more straightforward. However, there's a large factor within the development cycle, or more specifically just before it, that is important to point out. Take-Two Interactive acquired the Max Payne franchise from Remedy and 3D Realms for a slight $10 million in December 2001, only a few months after the original's release. Take-Two then announced incentives of up to $8 million to develop Max Payne 2. So this would now mean that Rockstar Games had taken up the reins to have a more secure place in the development of this game, more specifically being the sole publisher of Max Payne 2. Much of the staff that worked on the original, such as series creator Sam Lake himself, returned to write the plot and had a much more nuanced approach to writing it this time around. He described his new aspiration for the plot of Max Payne 2 to reflect that of a film noir love story, as he thought that would be the best direction for Max Payne's character after the events of the original game. Much of the development of the game stayed the same, but it doesn't seem that as much details were released for this game in comparison to Max Payne's first outing. The screenplay that was written for the game's narrative ended up being significantly larger than the original by over 3 times, creating a narrative that would end up being much more complex than the original. The game does utilize the same engine as Max Payne 1, but with a few significant upgrades in terms of graphical and technical fidelity. The polygon count has now been increased, which makes the characters' textures a lot more smoother than their roughened nature in the original. They have greater facial expressions, and a new physics engine was designed to allow for certain actions that weren't possible in the original with limited technological advances. For example, boxes could be moved and followed the laws of gravitation, as well as explosions making enemies fall more gracefully than their ragdoll nature in the original game. These might sound simple now, but at the time, this was a development in games unlike any other, and it would help push the industry forward in terms of a technical and graphical perspective. A few improvements would also be introduced to the bullet time ability, as well as sounds of certain weapons, projectiles, and explosions sounding more realistic. The game would release on the 14th of October in 2003 to much critical acclaim, as the focus of the praise centered around the refined and incredible gameplay, as well as the more focused story that wasn't as prevalent in the original. The major criticism for the game would end up being its length, which was hours shorter than the original on average, which even fans of the franchise have spoken upon. In terms of a gameplay standpoint, Max Payne 2 isn't significantly indifferent to that of the original, other than the introduction of a few major upgrades to the gameplay system and mechanics that were already in place. As mentioned before, a video game sequel must strive not to specifically create an entire new gameplay system or create something of revolutionary substance. Instead, the game must improve and innovate upon the systems already in place. Max Payne 2 has done exactly that, as it didn't stray far from what made the original's gameplay innovative in the first place, and stuck with the mindset more of the same in terms of gameplay, while still taking strides to improve the problems occurring with the original's gameplay mechanics. The gameplay pretty much revolves around the combat scenarios and a few platforming sections, much like the first game, but the sections of gameplay which aren't exclusive to combat aren't exactly anything to write home about. The weapon variety, which needed some more diversity than the original, is definitely improved upon, with a new batch of assault rifles and SMGs that help mix up combat scenarios, especially in this game, as the number of enemies per encounter seems to be much higher than the original. In the original, enemies would only fight you in smaller groups, while here they fight all together, firing from all directions, which makes the ability of bullet time that much more significant and vital to how you must survive. The AI, however, stays relatively the same in terms of their scripted nature, but it did seem to me that in this game they were a lot more aggressive, barging into rooms, throwing grenades at a greater pace, etc. They make the combat scenarios a little more intense intense. However, the enemies still aren't smart enough to really put up a fight unless they are in larger numbers. The levels again are quite linear, but as mentioned in my retrospective of the original, the levels do seem quite open-ended, and there's a few different pathways in terms of interactivity with the environment around you. This can again make navigation a little confusing, as there's not many ways to tell whether the path you're taking is going to be the right one, other than the cues that Max has for the player in terms of internal monologue, as he speaks on what he needs to do next. The combat itself has been improved a little bit, as the maneuvering and bullet time and how the ability is utilized has been improved upon. Jumping and utilizing the ability will not deplete the meter, making this a risky yet effective way to take down groups of enemies when jumping from a vantage point. This creates some of the most creative kills that the game can muster up, as at certain times you will find that jumping off a stairwell or a higher floor and activating bullet time in that scenario produces a highly engaging way of taking down foes. Other than that, the only other improvement in terms of a gameplay perspective is one that is extremely simplistic but was definitely needed, which is being able to utilize projectiles such as grenades or Molotov cocktails without having to disarm yourself like in the original. There's also AI companions in different levels of the game, but they don't do much to support you, and they end up dying fairly quickly without having any effect on the story or the gameplay as a whole. Now we'll quickly discuss how in some sections of the game the player may control Mona Sachs. Mona doesn't play too differently to Max, but playing as her from a story perspective lets us see the encounter and scenarios the pair get up to in varying perspectives. What Mona did have was a bit more mobility in terms of flipping backwards and doing tricks while in combat scenarios that made her a little different to Max in terms of how you'd approach each scenario. She's a lot more versatile in terms of a combat perspective, and I felt that I could be more aggressive playing as her than Max. She also wields a pair of Desert Eagles, which as Max is extremely difficult to pull off due to limited ammo, but for Mona she's always wielding them and a sniper rifle. Although she isn't drastically different to Max in terms of a gameplay perspective, I believe seeing the game in a different perspective in terms of a combat and gameplay perspective does help mix it up and diversify the scenarios a little more, where they could become a little dry due to the sheer frequency of them. To end off, there's also a final boss fight at the end of the game, if you could really call it that, against Vladimir Lem. It's not a very enticing boss fight, and just involves dodging an infinite amount of grenades that he throws down from a vantage point, while you have to dodge and shoot the anchors that hold up the platform that he stands on. With this, he succumbs to his death, and so this isn't very interesting, and a disappointing way to end the game off in terms of its gameplay, despite the game's ability to muster up something creative with its unique bullet time mechanic. One of mine and other critics' major points of contention with the original was the narrative that was entirely lackluster compared to the innovative gameplay. It definitely wasn't bad, but as I mentioned in my retrospective of the original, it's quite predictable and isn't anything entirely original, despite the ability to make it so. So when I spoke earlier about being a perfect sequel in terms of a narrative, the game had to improve and develop the characters featured further, introduce new ones potentially, and expand upon the themes presented in the original. You can already guess that the complexity and storytelling and the capability of Remedy to develop Max into a tragic love story is something entirely remarkable by 2003 standards. Developing Max further, his motives and the plot entirely is what makes this game a perfect sequel in terms of a storytelling onlook. To begin the discussion of the game's plot, I'll first lay down a story synopsis to get myself and everyone else back to speed to further discuss my thoughts on the narrative and its characters. The story again starts from Max being in a scenario that the player has no idea about, where Max narrates his ventures to get to that point, recalling the events of the last few days. This is what the player will play through, as they go through all the different narrated scenarios Max goes through in order to get to the starting cutscene, which is also coincidentally the end of the narrative as well. Max Payne has now been acquitted of the charges that were laid against him at the end of the first game, and is again reinstated in his old job as a detective for the NYPD. While investigating a gunfight at a warehouse owned by his prior ally in the first game, Russian mobster Vladimir Lem, Max encounters a group of hitmen who are trying to kill him, known purely as the Cleaners. These Cleaners have raided the warehouse for the weapons within, which Max is trying to identify why. During this entire operation, Max runs into contract killer Mona Sachs, who he previously thought had died 2 years ago. The game then returns to a previous hospital scene, where Max works his way to eliminate the Cleaners that are trying to assassinate him, and is able to escape the building. While this is going on, Max is curious as to what really happened with Mona Sachs, who previously escapes from the warehouse house without any clues for Max to follow her. While tracking her down within the inner circle, that's when he finally discovers that the target of the cleaners is purely on him and Mona Sachs, who is a suspect for the murder of a senator and is currently being pursued by other police forces within New York. Max decides to visit Senator Alfred Woden, who is the leader of the inner circle and is the one that was able to remove any traces of Max's involvement with the events of the first game. Woden reveals to Max that Vlad is also a member of the inner circle, who is focused on getting rid of Woden and is the one that hired the cleaners in the first place to take over Woden's position and take over the inner circle, which would definitely give him control over the criminal underbelly of New York. Max manages to save another mobster at threat of death due to Vlad's men, and the two head to Mona's hideout for assistance. However, Vlad is able to ambush both of them as he kills Vinny, the other mobster, and heavily injures Max before revealing that Mona is working for Woden. Mona betrays Max and attempts to follow her order to eliminate him, but finds herself unable to do so due to her feelings. They end the game by both of them kissing before she's shot to death, as Max then fights Vlad while Woden's mansion burns around them until Max finally achieves the killing blow. As you can probably tell just by the game's synopsis for its narrative, the story here is a lot more complex and entrenched in realism than that of the original game. It focuses on themes of betrayal and forbidden love, one that cannot flourish due to the circumstances at hand. Max and Mona are in love, but the fact they both fight for completely different motives divides them, and they are not able to see the light on certain situations. Max tries to pursue this love, but Mona isn't as interested in the love at most points in the game until the very end, when she also prioritizes this forbidden love above all else. The narrative focuses on Max's trauma and how it leads into other facets of his life. He cannot escape the initial trauma of his wife and child's death, and as a result, he fumbles in every other venture he embarks on. This theme is also carried on to the third game, which I'll discuss in a separate video, but the narrative of this game is excellent. The complexity takes a higher tolerance compared to the first, and the game truly is able to form a narrative that is full of themes and characters that feel alive. To make the characters in the world feel alive in 2003 was quite a daunting task, and the fact that Remedy was able to do so really displays the sheer talent and quality of the team that was working relentlessly in order to build the game. The first game's narrative suffers a lot from its predictability and the fact that it isn't complex in any way. The sequel, on the other hand, is able to see what worked in terms of a character and theme perspective in the first game and is able to carry that over in order to build a narrative that would have a much greater impact on the audience. And I can say with confidence, the narrative of Max Payne 2 is simply brilliant. Well, that's it then. My second retrospective on the Max Payne series and an analysis of the second game in the series. I'll be discussing the third game in depth in about a week as well, so anticipate that if you're interested in this series so far. If you haven't already, check out my retrospective on the original to see further insight into my analysis of these games. Now, I'll quickly discuss what videos are going to be next in the schedule. There will be a Yakuza series video, which the thumbnail will be on screen now. This is a concept I'd like to try for other video game series, so please check out the video if you are interested. Next on the roster will hopefully be a Force Unleashed retrospective, and then with that will come the Max Payne 3 retrospective. I hope you've all enjoyed the video up to this point, and I thank you for getting in this far. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. I'll see you all in the next one. Peace. Max Payne 3 is often heralded as the anomaly piece in the Max Payne franchise. To most, it strayed too much from the original games, in which the tone and structural integrity of 3 went miles away from what the original games had offered. With a staunch understanding of Max Payne as a character and building a story upon a base that the original creators had already finished by Max Payne 2's ending, Rockstar had no outside help to ensure that they fit Max Payne with a new suit, deserving of taking him out of his comfort. Often, much of the criticism around Max Payne 3 wasn't its incredible gameplay or its story that strayed tonally away from the original games at a surface level, but instead it was the fact that the game was completely different in style to Remedy's games. And well, that is kind of expected, as Rockstar had taken up the full reins to develop the game, where Remedy had decided they were done with the character and his story and would move on to new projects. In vein of my other retrospectives on the first two games, we'll be covering the development of Max Payne 3, and I think it's especially important to point out the differences in development here, when Rockstar is now the sole proprietor of the franchise at this point. Max Payne 3 was announced in early 2009 and was scheduled to release later that year. However, the game would be pushed back to 2010 alongside other releases that Take-Two Interactive was working on for that year. They claimed that they needed more development time. However, at the time of the announcement, the developers were still scurrying on to find voice actors and such to record lines, so 2009 release seemed awfully optimistic and even more so impossible at the stage of development the game was at. Just to hold off fans for a little while, they would release 2 new screenshots for the game, so to let fans know that the game was eagerly being worked on by the staff at Rockstar. Again, on September 11th of 2011, this time Rockstar would announce a March 2012 release date for the game, alongside the first debut trailer for the game as well. But again, Take-Two would delay the game by 2 months from its original March release to May 2012. They would state that the decision was purely to ensure that Max Payne 3 delivers the highest quality that they can offer. In an interview in 2011, Dan Houser, one of the lead writers at Rockstar Games at the time, would state that unlike what others may think, Rockstar likes to spend a little bit of time after they'd finished the project to decide what exactly they were going to do next, and they decided that Max Payne 3 would be their next release due to the anticipation that had built up after a long 8-year gap in the game's chronology from Max Payne 2 in the last decade. Interestingly enough, Rockstar would deploy a tactic that Remedy had used for the first game, where because much of the game was set in a completely new location opposed to the first 2 games in New York, Rockstar developers traveled to Brazil and took photographs of both lower class and higher class living areas in order to realistically build their understanding and image of Brazilian life to best suit the game's various environments. The game also had a larger than usual marketing campaign, and Rockstar had really tried to hone in the game's release around the world with an expensive campaign. The game would release to quite favorable reviews of about 87 out of 100 on Metacritic, but there was harsh criticism concerning the departure in tone and style from the original games, and that it simply wasn't as good as the second game. Well, this video is clearly titled as a defense video of Max Payne 3, and I wish to keep the contents of the video to the same level. In my other retrospectives, I would discuss the basics of what built up the bullet time mechanic and how it differentiates the franchise entirely from many other third-person shooters at the time. To me, I feel that I hold Max Payne 3 in a light of its own. It took everything that worked from the original games and melded it together to create a gameplay system that is robust, innovative, and most importantly, extremely fun. This part of the game is something that didn't really deviate from the original games, and it stays relatively the same in terms of still utilizing the bullet time mechanic and how exactly the combat does work. But of course, with almost 8 years of advancements in technology since the release of the second game, Max Payne 3 would be the most detailed, most brutal, and most enticing game in the bunch in terms of its gameplay mechanics. Max Payne 3 utilizes the bullet time mechanic a bit more differently than the other games. In this, I mean in terms of mobility with the ability, and the versatility of situations within the game gives the ability a much greater use in my opinion. But let's talk from the top and break down the gameplay mechanics in its various sections, which, like the first 2 games, the combat is the majority of the game's runtime in terms of gameplay, so we'll be focusing on that as for the most part, because that's pretty much what the gameplay of Max Payne 3 is about. Firstly, the guns of Max Payne 3 are way better than the first 2 games. The pistol, the SMG, the shotgun all feel like they have weight this time around, and the game is a lot more grounded in reality in terms of its shooting than the other games, where any gun would suffice in any situation. Here there is realistic recoil, and utilizing different weapons in various scenarios is absolutely necessary to kill your enemies effectively. In the first 2 games, I saw myself being able to use a pistol for the entire game, even in long distance situations, due to the bullet drop not at all being there, and the fact that the weapons didn't really lose their power even when firing from long range. In this game, each weapon feels more tailored to a specific area or scenario, and it doesn't feel like you could effectively shoot a shotgun from long range and still be able to kill your enemy. Each time I'd use a shotgun, it'd only be in a scenario where the enemy wasn't more than a few meters away from me, and this realistic understanding of the weapons featured within this game makes it feel more grounded and makes the combat a lot more diverse. Now let's talk about the bullet time ability, because at the end of the day, that's the only reason why you'd really boast about the gameplay of Max Payne 3. It's fantastic utilization of the bullet time ability even 8 years after the release of Max Payne 2. Even if for some fans the tone and style of the game differed heavily from the original games, I don't think anyone can deny how polished and well done the bullet time ability and the combat in this game really is. The diversity, versatility, and mobility within combat has been intermixed to be a lot more fun than it was in the other games. I was able to pull off kills that would have been practically impossible in the other games. Jumping through windows or jumping off stairwells while wielding pistols or shotguns and raining down hellfire upon the enemies below is is some of the most satisfying gunplay I've ever had the pleasure of experiencing in a video game. With the ability now being enhanced in terms of its use, I felt that I could be a lot more aggressive. Running and utilizing the ability was at the heart of fun within this game. The number of enemies has been increased as well, and you'll fight more enemies in one scenario than you did in the original games. The AI is a lot more intelligent than they were before, so although you can rush, you've still got to be cautious, especially in scenarios where you've got limited ammo for the most part. That's where Max Payne 3's extremely improved cover system comes through. The cover system in this game isn't exactly innovative or anything, not that you can really revolutionize a mechanic that is at the core of third-person shooters. The cover system is something you'll see yourself actually utilizing a lot, because in this instance, the game doesn't throw around painkillers everywhere like it did in the original games, and that's in part due to the fact that the interactivity of the environments is a lot less technical than the other games. Where I could open every drawer and crevice in the original games, in Max Payne 3 I'll only be able to open up areas where there's a planned painkiller already set in motion. That's pretty much the only thing that I missed from the other games, and I think it's balanced by the fact that the environments and levels in this game are full of detail and life, which wasn't present in the grim and tonally dark places in the other games. In terms of combat, maneuvering is also a lot more improved, and diving within the bullet time ability and jumping around in general feels like a much more versatile and viable option than before. Diving and slowing down time while precisely choosing where to shoot before the ability runs out is what makes the combat so intense and fast paced. Also, while in combat and you've been shot down to hell, the game offers a last stand mechanic which grants the player a quick moment to kill an enemy that is near to come back alive, as long as you've got a painkiller with you. Being able to only hold 2 weapons at a time makes the combat more realistic and makes it more intense, because the situation of running out of ammo to shoot your enemies down is a lot more relevant here than it was before, which makes you fight your enemies with a lot more precision and accuracy than what you do beforehand. The engaging nature of the combat with many improved and well thought out mechanics has allowed Max Payne 3 to still be an innovative third-person shooter, which I don't see much games even nowadays being able to compare to. Due to the sheer diversity within combat that surely makes each encounter within the game drastically different to the last. Lastly, the levels and environments within the game are all so well crafted and polished, with different avenues to kill enemies with due to the environment's diversity in different scenarios. In the other games, I felt that you'd be in a building for most of the game, and the environments didn't really change from building to building, and sometimes I thought I was just running around in a circle due to the game's less than stellar utilization of navigation for the player. Max Payne 3's environments are so well made and feel entirely realistic, probably in part due to the fact that the developers actually traveled to Brazil in order to truly understand how they were going to build the various environments of lower class and higher class Brazilian infrastructure within the game, and this level of polish is carried on to all other aspects of the game and just makes Max Payne 3's gameplay so incredibly enticing. In my previous retrospectives, when I spoke about the narratives of the games, I just gave a long synopsis of the story, followed with only very minor thoughts on the game from my own perspective. This time I want to focus more on my own thoughts about the game and how the themes and style of Max Payne 3 are still able to fit the character despite a drastic separation from the other games in a lot of its aspects, and so I won't be relying on a story synopsis this time round. So one of the most common complaints about Max Payne 3 by both fans and critics of the franchise alike is the fact that it just doesn't feel like a Max Payne game in any way. They surely meant this in the way the game delivered its narrative, and probably in part as well to the extremely contrasting environments that Max Payne 3 takes you through, as opposed to the skyscrapers and snow of New York that fans of the franchise were so accustomed to at this point. I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with change, especially with a franchise that kept it quite streamlined for the first 2 games. They used the same environments and places to build the narrative, and that's still an excellent trope. Making people familiar with the dim city of New York in Max Payne allows the player to more understand the circumstances that that environment will hold in Max Payne 2. So when Rockstar came into the picture to make the 3rd game, everyone knows that they are usually a company that likes to keep innovating and changes their franchise with each entry to make it feel completely different to the first, while still understanding how to make a perfect sequel. This is seen in Red Dead Redemption 2, which to me isn't isn't a perfect sequel in terms of gameplay due to not really changing anything from the first game, but in terms of a narrative, I think Red Dead Redemption 2 is a huge step up for the Red Dead franchise, and Rockstar understood how to build the characters up without ruining their character arcs in the original game. In Max Payne 3, I feel like there's definitely an obvious understanding by the writers of who Max Payne really is. They didn't just take the character in the franchise and flip it on its head. The writers surely knew the events of Max Payne's life, and they utilized the themes of his somber life in order to complete the character in his mission. Max is a man wasted by drinking and wasting his time with mourning, to the point where the value of his life becomes more and more redundant as he goes through the various harrowing events of the game. He even states that he's disappointed by the fact that he hasn't already died, and the recurring tragedy of his life's events are all caused by the fact that he even exists within the world of Max Payne. Everything in his life has been going downhill for him since the death of his family. The family's death was the spark to Max's rampages and events in the first two games. He never got true satisfaction even when he got his revenge. His life keeps coming in circles where, even though in the first game it seemed that his mission was done and dusted and that he had finished what he started, he comes back in the second game with a lust for a feeling he forgot. Love is what he yearns for, and although he strives for the entirety of the second game to get it, and we see him embrace it for a few moments, another tragedy strikes him purely due to his involvement within the criminal underworld. His love is gone and the feeling again escapes him, so it's no wonder why in Max Payne 3 he's an addicted, sad old man who doesn't care for no one. He just does his job without any enthusiasm, and he lives each day being ungrateful for the fact that he lives through situations which he hopes to die in. This recurring theme of tragedy pops up again when he fails to save Fabiana. He takes all this time to come and find her, but him being there again causes the curse of tragedy to ensue upon his life. He sees this theme again and again, and he cannot escape it. Tragedy and its curse follows him wherever he goes. He gets trapped in the vicious cycle of crime and killing, one that he hoped he had left in America. He stirs up events that seem so out of his reach that he somehow prevails without any hope of getting through it. His life works on the tragedy of his own existence. He's so enthralled by the cycle of death that nothing else envelopes him, nothing else excites him. But he doesn't want to be interested in the cycle of death, but at the point in his life that he is at now, nothing else really suffices. So when at the end of the game he takes down an army with his bare hands, it's incredibly satisfying. Despite the fact that he's killed a lot of people and the blood of innocence may be on his hands, Max still finds a way to be triumphant and be the so-called hero of his own story. So when the ending arose and he sat at a beach drinking some Brazilian soda, that's when I understood that his character was truly complete. And the lingering idea that I had before the game as to why Max Payne 4 wasn't a thing was entirely erased from my mind. He left alcohol and he left his life of killing. That was the end of his character, one so well done, and an ending that I hold in much higher regard in the first two games due to the build-up of his character that has occurred due to the excellent work of writers from both Remedy and Rockstar Games. Max Payne 3's immersive nature, where its gameplay and story are so incredibly different from its predecessors, opens a gap in what this game is to be defined as. Sure, it's called Max Payne 3, but whether it holds the prowess of the original games is to be debated. It differentiates itself from those games, but it feels more like a spiritual one-game reboot than it feels like a sequel to the second Max Payne game. Max Payne 3 takes everything in terms of themes and gameplay mechanics it can from the original, and it's obvious that Rockstar's writers knew who the character was and is, but they went a direction that already established fans of the character and previous games wouldn't expect for Max. It could be the fact that I hold zero nostalgia for any of the games, and I've only played all three in the last month or so, but understanding what makes Max Payne 3 better than the other games in every aspect is what brought me to the conclusion that although it serves as a sequel in name, everything about it is so drastically different and separated from the first two games that I see it in its own light. But while saying this, I also feel that the game was able to truly end Max's character. Max Payne 2's ending was fantastic, a tragedy unlike any other, but I didn't personally feel satisfied that the cold-blooded killer that is Max Payne would just stop like that the death of one person would stop him from being involved in the worlds of crime and danger again. That's why the narrative of Max Payne 3 is so incredibly unique. It keeps this theme of recurring tragedy that was so prevalent in the other games. It showcases that Max just can't take a break, and the trauma of his past life events stay with him and affect his every decision. The spark of his family's death has left an ordinary American man grounded in a world of death and suffering, but Max proclaims several times that this is where he feels home the most, that this is his place. It's interesting to see how the man that seeks only revenge keeps himself unintentionally stuck in a loop of crime and killing, even when he doesn't want to. He didn't go to Brazil to kill people, but instead he ends up taking down a prominent politician within the country to his demise, and exposes a horrific plot of human trafficking and brutality. And honestly, this video sums up why I think that Max Payne 3 is indefinitely the best game within the trilogy, and a game that is severely underrated among the ranks of Rockstar's other masterpieces. Well, there it is folks, the final piece of a Max Payne series retrospective. Shortly after this video is released, I'll make a video which will have all of these retrospectives together in one video, and at the end I'll be ranking each individual game based on its merits, and I'll explain why each game is in the position that it's in. I think it's obvious which game will be on the top, but still give the video a look when it comes out. If you haven't already seen my other retrospectives on the other two games, they will be in the description for you to check out, or you can just wait until the big video comes out. As for what's next in terms of my videos, a Force Unleashed retrospective will come out next week, and there probably won't be a follow-up of its sequel anytime soon because I just haven't played it yet. After that, I'd like to start a retrospective series on the Middle-earth Shadow games, which are absolutely fantastic, so keep an eye here if you're interested. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. I'll see you all in the next one. Peace. Coming in at third place is the first game in the series, the original Max Payne. I think to preface this entire section, I think all the games have their own little flair and are all great, especially for the times they released, but the original has to be the worst of them all in terms of a mechanical and narrative perspective. No, it's not bad at all, and it holds up extremely well, and the game is still pretty fun to play. But when you look at the other two entries succeeding it, the story and gameplay mechanics of the original pale in comparison to the constant innovation and evolution of the game's aspects that can be seen in the other entries. But what Max Payne did do was solidify this theme of tragedy for Max, which we'd see in the other games as well, and it's an awesome origin story for Max, and the motives of him in this game do carry on over to the other games, and the gameplay for actually introducing the bullet time mechanics is also quite fantastic. The interactivity of the environments is also really impressive, and the wonderful soundtrack made the story and atmosphere of the game really feel gloomy and depressing, which is what the game should have been, seeing as it focused on the death of Max's family. The only problem I really found was that yes, some of the textures and whatnot were outdated, which doesn't really matter, but the weapon variety and how the bullet time ability works isn't as polished as the other two games, and the weapons are only a very few in the game. Other than that, it's still an excellent game, and I still really enjoyed playing through this game even today. Of course, if you've watched my other retrospectives and this video in its entirety, you probably all saw this coming. Max Payne 2 is an absolutely brilliant game with a somber and well-written story, themes that have been carried on from the first but perfected unlike before. The music is also really excellent, being leagues better than the original while still keeping this aroma of tragedy in the game's atmosphere at all times, adding to the overall immersion and experience of the player at hand. The story has to be, in my opinion, the best aspect of the game, as the sheer excellence in writing capabilities by Remedy and the ability to weave in a tragic love story which echoes what happened to Max in the first game really brings the whole series together. In terms of themes and atmosphere, the game has so many different environments, with all of them having their own established atmospheres and purposes, which really adds to the level of immersion a player will have while playing through the game. The gameplay has been incredibly refined in this entry, and everything that worked from the original has been carried over, of course including the bullet time ability. But the way it works in this game is so much better, and the mechanics behind it allow for a lot more versatile and mobile combat than before. The weapon variety is also widely expanded, and the way that the game is played just feels a lot more intuitive than the original in pretty much every aspect. Overall, this game is also excellent, and for me is very close to the #1 ranking and still holds up extremely well, and I recommend it to anyone who somehow hasn't played it yet. I think most people that saw my Max Payne 3 retrospective earlier in this video or separately when I released it about a week back knew that this game was going to be in the #1 spot. Max Payne 3 is absolutely excellent, from the almost perfect gunplay mechanics, the stylized narrative that borrowed so many elements from the original, and the game that was just able to cap off the entire series with a bang. The gameplay here is undisputably fantastic. The bullet time ability hasn't been any greater up until this point, and the way it works is so intuitive, allowing for kills that were so out of reach in the other games due to their restrained nature in terms of mobility. The weapon variety is also fantastic, and utilizing all the different weapons really allows for the combat to stay diverse and keep changing as you play and adapt to certain situations the games throw you in. The way the guns work as well is absolutely fantastic, and I've got to say, out of any third-person shooter I've ever played, Max Payne 3 holds the merits as having the most intuitive and fun gunplay I've ever experienced, with it holding up extremely well even several years after its initial release. The stylized nature of the narrative for me was also really awesome, and I like how it carried over this theme of recurring tragedy felt by Max in the other two games, but utilized it completely as the main point of the narrative, and the way the game ended by completing Max's ultimate character arc was absolutely brilliant. Anyway, it's an absolutely excellent game, and I recommend it to anyone who loves a good shooter, and for me, it's definitely the best entry within the amazing Max Payne franchise.